Black Lives Matter at BU. Black Lives Matter at BU. Black Lives Matter at BU. It was on this cold day in December of 2014 when I felt the pressure of a generation of geniuses trapped in the timeless telltale of tantalizing treasures bottled in 40 ounces of treachery. 1 ounce for every acre my ancestors demanded. Pierces into the nooks and crannies of my soul as I felt the concrete cool pavement at the intersection of Hampton and Clarendon Road. Now, this intersection was so similar to the intersection Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw talked about in the hueless halls of UCLA, Columbia, and Cornell. But instead of diversity education about gender pronouns and racial identity, I was experiencing epithets and epiphanies about racism and white supremacy as I laid in the street during a die-in, saying rest in power to the fallen black king named Michael Brown. Screaming from the Twitter fingers that type fast, from the social media channels sutured into anonymity, and whispers in the hallways that were built on the backs of curriculums rooted in hypocrisy, I was experiencing unprecedented pushback to my personality because I was unapologetically proud to be black. You see, I was one of innumerable students who were responding to a growing concern, a concern that many predominantly white institutions were censoring, that our black lives still did not matter after 6 centuries of supremacy of the whitest and wrongest kinds. You see, I was one of 4 students who, in response to the white lash and black lashings, created a movement in response to a moment in which our beautiful, bold, and black tuition paying, student organization serving, late night paper writing selves still did not matter. And what was profound was that in addition to those preceding 6 centuries of supremacy, there were also 6 decades and beyond of black stories at our institution that matched these sentiments. Narratives of black power pushing against the institutional endorsement of white hate. So in response, we did not wait. In fact, we began to bust the bubble, a bubble that was bubbling and ballooning with anti-black narratives, but popped thanks to the pushing and pulling of student activists whose kingly behavior and whose messages tailored to a Davidic dedication to making it make sense in service to the most marginalized students on campus and beyond. Our movement, you see, we were students to the movement first and to the university second. So we seized an opportunity, but that opportunity was not without precedent. You see, our movement sat in the context of a moment, and that sat in the lap of a long-lasting lament, and that lament was lauded by many voices. And today we speak on black liberation, so I want to highlight 2. The voices being the mother of the Black Liberation Army, Assata Shakur. The other voice being the father of black liberation theology, Dr. James Cone. In 1961, 2 black college students began developing a relationship that would change the way the world saw the term liberation. These 2 students would create a movement, a party that would provide free food to school children, free health care to the most marginalized communities, and free political education to the people most crippled by capitalism in Philadelphia, in Chicago, in Oakland, in cities across the world. Their names, Huey Newton and Bobby Seale. And 5 years after meeting at Merritt College, they went on to found the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense. Now, while the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense went on to shorten their name to the Black Panther Party, that shortening of their name was not a reflection of the impact of that party. You see, their impact as a political party, as a community organization, as an institution of security for black folks extended globally for 15 years. And you know what? It would have went longer had it not been for the federal intrusion of the party by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. named the greatest threat to national security in the late 60s and early 70s. J. Edgar Hoover launched a counterintelligence program to dismantle the Panthers. Now, as this fight between the FBI and the freedom-fighting Black Panthers ensued, another movement, an underground movement began called the Black Liberation Army. And the mindset of this militia was that if the governments are going to continue to infiltrate and annihilate the greatest force to Black power, well, the movement to liberate Black folks from the shackles of police violence and capitalism cannot cease. And there was no voice more adamant about this advancement than the mother of this militia, Assata Shakur. Assata unapologetically believes that we have a duty to fight for our freedom. We have a duty to win, to love, and that there is nothing holding us, nothing than the chains that are connected to systems and structures that are stopping us from achieving Black excellence. Now, like many members of the Black Liberation Army, Assata was formerly a Panther, but her departure from the Panthers was rooted in a pursuit to see a more explicit fight for freedom and a vision for liberation that was not designed exclusively for the Bobbies and the Hueys, but also the Angelas and the Assatas and the Affinis. We cannot and should not speak on the term Black liberation without giving credit where credit is due to this armed struggle that brought Black liberation to life. And their mission was clear: to take up arms for the liberation and self-determination of Black folks globally. And Assata Shakur wanted to accomplish that by any means necessary. Her story, it inspired her fight for freedom. She lived in community with her concept of liberation. And she named herself after the struggle that made her a fugitive to the federal forces that didn't want her to be free in the first place. By 1969, the Black Panther Party was at an all-time high. I mean, they had membership at peak numbers. They had started their breakfast program and their Black liberation schools. And they were getting recognition by major Black figures in so many spaces: athletics, entertainment, politics. Simultaneously, however, the Black Panthers were under attack, inside and out. And this attack was purely unprecedented. COINTELPRO was in full effect, and the people could tell. In 1969, many members of the Panthers were killed, including the deputy chairman of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, Fred Hampton. Now, some folks will believe that the narrative of 1969 for the Black Panther Party was that they were in their golden era, their golden age. But another narrative would say that 1969 marked the beginning of the end of the Black Panther Party. In 1969, we saw another voice involved in this conversation about Black liberation. In 1969, Dr. James Cone, the father of Black liberation theology, took on a position as assistant professor at Union Theological Seminary and also published his first book, Black Theology and Black Power. This text introduced and influenced a new school of thought that was heavily influenced by the Black Power movement, but spoke its truth from pulpits to pews instead of political programs, pamphlets, and protests. Dr. Cone introduced an interpretation of the Christian gospel that sat with a particular truth speaking to a specific power that was quite remnant of the political progressiveness of formerly enslaved Black preachers like Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and Nat Turner, but with a more modern spin and a pro-Black conviction like Malcolm X and Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. I remember the first time that I read one of his texts. I was in college, and it was his second book, a Black theology of liberation. And in that text, he said, but the concept of Black, which includes what the world means by oppression and what the gospel means by liberation, is the only concept that has any real significance today. If Christ is not Black, then who is he? You see, Cone was shifting a narrative that said that Christ was white since capitalism was created. And now he was telling a story about a Christ that was as Black as the movement for Black power. I don't believe it to be a coincidence that the same year that we see Cone introduce Black Jesus to academia, we see the greatest force for Black power seeing unprecedented appeal. If we're to speak on the term Black liberation, we cannot ignore its spiritual significance, especially considering it sits in servitude to an institution that has been an advocate for Black folks since they first were imported into this country like property in slave ships on the eastern coast shore in 1619, the Black church. Now, while we can critique the Black church for their inability to be inclusive and their inability to practice equity in a proper way, it is still important to remember their impact in these conversations contextualizing Black liberation. My oratorical mentor, who's also a grandson of this movement for Black liberation theology, is Reverend Dr. Frederick Douglass Haynes III. And he says that a text without context is merely a pretext for conning people. And I would hate for us to con ourselves out of an incredible opportunity to capture this true definition of Black liberation because we are criticizing an institution that deserves it, because of their historical endorsement of heteropatriarchy. If I could just speak to Dr. James Cone today, I think that he would stand in solidarity with my statement that whiteness is as devilish as Blackness is divine. Similarly, if I could just chop it up with Assata Shakur, I believe she would too stand in solidarity with my statement that the response to racism is neither capitalism nor communism. It is neither socialism nor Marxism. You see, crimes against humanity cannot be rationalized by rations of radical ratios in economics when those same systems are rooted in the repression, oppression, depression, and suppression of marginalized peoples. Instead, I would suggest that the response to racism, to oppression, to incarceration is freedom. It is emancipation. It is liberation. Liberation of the most beautiful, bold, and Black kind. Whether it was chanting Black Lives Matter at BU in 2014 in response to the murder of Michael Brown, or it was shouting at the top of our lungs, say her name, in response to the asphyxiation of Sandra Bland in 2015, or singing We Shall Overcome in 1955 at an open casket funeral for a young boy named Emmett Till, or it was whispering Wade in the Water in 1821 in response to the Missouri Compromise and Mason-Dixon line. One thing reigns to be true, that Black death always triggers ideas of what it means to be free. Free from gunshots from white cops, free from bombings from white hoods, free from institutional endorsement of ignorance from predominantly white institutions. You see, this term free is in the middle of so many conversations right now that's still being developed, because freedom in a country that incarcerates the masses is corrupt. It's confusing and it's complicated. But in the midst of the confusion, the complication, and the corruption, one thing remains consistent. And that consistency is our stories of strife, our stories of struggle, our stories of the fight for freedom. In the same way that a young Black man named Matthew Johnson, an unarmed Black teen in San Francisco, was murdered by the San Francisco Police Department, his murder sparked the birth of the Black Panther Party. In the same way that in 2012, the murder of Trayvon Martin sparked the birth of the Black Lives Matter movement. Again, while these murders are 46 years apart, there was one thing I know for sure, and it is that the narrative is consistent and the story is the same. Black deaths always inspire movements to preserve Black life. This TED Talk was inspired by a question that I ask myself consistently over and over again in preparation for this conversation about Black liberation. How many more Matthews and Trayvons? How many more Sandras and Briannas? How many more Marshas and Ayannas? Black folks whose stories were only shared after they were suffocated by white supremacy. Until black stories are taken more seriously, before we are left to the mercy of knee-jerk reactions to oppressive systems. Well-meaning white folks will not end white supremacy, and relationships won't end racism. Only systems can shatter systems. But in order to create systems that shatter systems, we must build cultures that are actually competent. And that competency is rooted in the verification and validation of a vernacular that acknowledges the power in the language of black stories, because that language understands that inside of our stories, inside of black stories, is the vision for freedom that we all yearn for. Freedom sits rent-free inside of our stories, and it is impossible to evict emancipation. I challenge you, I dare you today to take a seat inside of your story and to begin taking residence in liberation. Storytelling is the most beautiful, bold, and black kind of liberation. It is the past, it is the present, and it is the future. To my comrades, loving yourself is a revolutionary action, and you are worth the revolution. Thank you.